Awesome, thank you, Elise. I would just like to start by welcoming everyone to Think Green. Today we're going to be talking about green infrastructure and civic engagement. I am your presenter, Juliana Greenberg. I currently work down at the Chesapeake Bay Program as environmental management staff for the Habitat. I have my email here on the bottom of the slide, and I'm going to have it again on my question slide. But I would just like to say I more than welcome all comments or follow-up questions after the presentation. Please reach out. I would love to hear from you all. So without further ado, let's get into it. I do want to start with a definition of green infrastructure because I know we hear that term thrown around a lot and it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So for the purposes of my presentation and to get us all on the same page, we're going to use this definition from American Rivers. Green infrastructure is an approach to water management that protects, restores, or mimics the natural water cycle. Green infrastructure is effective, economical, and enhances community safety and quality of life. I chose this definition for a couple of reasons. For one, I think it really gets to the heart of the issue of what we mean when we say green infrastructure. But also, I like that it sets up the what and then the why. And my presentation is going to kind of follow that same format for the first half. We're going to talk about the what of green infrastructure, the why of green infrastructure, and then during the second half, we're going to talk about one specific project. Now, to get a better sense of my audience, I do want to have a quick little Menti break. So if you could go on your phone or on your computer and log on to www.menti.com and type in this code at the bottom of the screen, I'm going to present a little Menti and we're going to ask, how familiar are you with green infrastructure? So that code again is now at the top of your screen, 4555277. And I just want you to take a look at those answers and click whichever one feels the most appropriate. We have 4 options. This is my first time hearing about green infrastructure, and if that's the case, then welcome. We're glad to have you. I know a little, but I'm not comfortable talking to others about it. I know some, and I'm happy to participate in occasional discussions of green infrastructure, or I frequently learn and talk about green infrastructure. Yes, thank you for putting that code in the chat, Krista. So let's just take a little bit of time and let these responses come in. It looks like we've got about half of the people, so I'll give you another minute or so. I don't want to take too long on this because it really is just getting set up for the rest of the presentation. Okay, great. It's looking like we're pretty much split down the middle of those middle 2. I'm going to, I think, move on with the presentation and assume that everyone falls in those 2 categories. For those of you who know some and are happy to participate in occasional discussions, some of this might be a little bit of a review that I'm about to go through, but bear with me and hopefully still learn something new. So let's get back to our slides here. And there is going to be one other Menti question later on in our presentation, so don't let that Menti get too far away from you. So now that we know that from our American Rivers definition that we are talking about green infrastructure, we're talking about protecting, restoring, or mimicking the natural water cycle. But that can include a lot of different projects on a lot of different scales. It's a super broad definition. So I wanted to take a couple minutes and go through some examples of what green infrastructure could look like or it might be. One classic example that many of you, most of you have probably heard of is a rain garden. And so I have here a little rain garden in a parking lot in Montgomery County, Maryland. So it is a depressed area of the landscape that collects flowing water from the impervious areas around it. And we can see that there are parking lots on either side. There's a road down in the background of the image. And so it collects all that water flowing off of there and retains the water in the depressed area after a peak flow event, the peak flow from a storm event. And so this will reduce localized flooding by allowing the water to re-infiltrate the ground more slowly, as well as allowing for some natural water filtration because the soil will do a little bit of that filtering for us so it doesn't run directly into the cutouts in the sidewalk and pretty much directly into the streams and rivers. Another example of green infrastructure is permeable pavement. So this image here shows an example of permeable pavement, which is something you've probably seen before, but may or may not have ever noticed. Between the tiles here, we can see that there is some unfilled gaps. There's no grout there or additional pavement. And this allows for the water that hits that pavement from rain or any other precipitation to re-enter the ground very close to where it initially hit and reduce overall impervious area. So the difference, there's a lot of differences between a rain garden and a permeable pavement, which I'm sure you can tell by looking at it. But one of the big things that's worth mentioning is that there's a lot less water that can be retained by permeable pavement, right? So we have these lots of little cracks as opposed to a big depressed area. And while a rain garden can hold more water, for instance, a permeable pavement might not collect as much pollutants and trash where the water is running off. If we look at our rain garden area, we can see there's a couple of pieces of trash that have collected from the surrounding parking lots. An additional benefit of something like permeable pavement is that it can be placed essentially without any changes to the existing design of an area. A rain garden takes up space, but permeable pavement can just be put in wherever there's pavement before. So there are little and big ways that we can add green infrastructure to existing areas. Then to go on a totally different area for our third type of green infrastructure we're going to look at, I wanted to mention wetland restoration. So wetland restoration still fits our definition of green infrastructure from the beginning, but it is in a very different way than the first two. Restoring a wetland provides new or improved habitat for many species. It can act as a natural filtration system, and it helps retain water that can be reconnected to the landscape and to the natural water table. So reconnecting this area to the water table helps restore that original water cycle we were talking about, but it's just in a totally different way. And often wetland restoration is referred to as nature-based design rather than green infrastructure, because really with something like a wetland restoration, we are kind of setting it and forgetting it. You put in this and let nature take its course. So it's really following the lead of nature and doesn't need as much human management, and there's not so much what we think of as traditional infrastructure. Then the final type of green infrastructure that I want to talk about today is the green roof. If there are any other UMD alumni on here, then you might recognize this image as the top of the Physical Sciences Complex at the University of Maryland. This green roof takes an area that would otherwise be a totally impervious surface, just a roof, and makes it living and more permeable to precipitation, while adding additional benefits such as insulation to the building. So now we've talked about a couple of examples, and before we move on, I want all of you to take a moment and think about why someone would choose to implement green infrastructure over the more traditional, quote unquote, gray infrastructure that does not include these natural or green elements. So take a moment and think, and when I say go, type in your answers to the chat, and when I say go, hit enter, and I want you to come up with one way that you or your students could explain choosing green infrastructure over gray. So I'm going to give you like 10 seconds, and then let's say go. So just hit enter, type it into the chat now, and let's take a look. Cleans runoff, co-benefits, water filtration. It looks nicer. Yeah, that's a great one. Environment and economical, water retention. These are fantastic. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about a lot of them on my next slide. Small streams are important for overall watershed health. Absolutely. Habitat, fantastic. So you guys are touching here on a lot of the really big benefits that we tout when we're trying to implement a green infrastructure project. So let's go on to my next slide, and we can talk a little bit more about why green infrastructure. So it sounds like you all and me are on really the same page with a couple of extra things that I wanted to talk about. So when we look at why someone would choose green infrastructure, there are things such as long-term cost effectiveness. One of the big reasons people don't choose green infrastructure is that it costs more upfront. It can often be very expensive to get in the ground. But over time, it often is more economical because it can help prevent future problems from arising. If you are putting in just another impervious surface, you're gonna get flooding and you're gonna have to deal with flooding down the line. So by just starting out with a green solution, you prevent that problem later on. They can often be more adaptable to climate change. Then we also have human health benefits. I don't know if anyone mentioned that in the chat, but in addition to people just liking the way that green things look, and there's been numerous studies on people healing faster if they can see something green out their window. So we do get real human health benefits from that. But there's also the pollution reduction aspect. We have reduced pollution in our waterways, reduced pollution in the air, a lot of really great benefits, especially now in our time of a global public health crisis from green infrastructure. Then beautification, it looks nice, as someone said. We just like things that are pretty. And then the two big ones I wanted to touch on that were not mentioned in the chat were educational and job opportunities. Green infrastructure is a great way to introduce a lot of students at any level to natural designs that they may not be seeing otherwise. It's a great way to get people excited about and interested in nature, but also in engineering and in stormwater runoff science. There's a lot of really interesting ways this can connect to broader education. And there's a lot of job opportunities it can bring, along with many, many other opportunities. On that note of job opportunities, I want to talk specifically about some of the job opportunities in green infrastructure. I know that a lot of you on the call today are teachers, and so I am really excited about this opportunity to talk more about how your students could get excited and involved in green infrastructure down the line. So some of the ones I want to touch on here are construction, are the people who are actually building a lot of these projects. Environmental engineering, mechanical and electrical engineering. We need the engineers to really figure out how we're going to make it work, you know, as we can have all of these high in the sky plans without the engineers, it doesn't do anything. Urban planning, we need people to figure out on a larger scale where we can put these projects, as well as on the smaller scale. And we need to look at cities moving forward, how they can be more sustainable. Gardening and planting maintenance. Once we put in a lot of these projects, they do need regular maintenance to be as effective. Stormwater manager and environmental scientists. These are people who are going to be crucial in really measuring the impact of the green infrastructure that we're putting in the ground, but also what the outcomes are, whether or not we've achieved our goals. And one last one that I did want to talk about was farming. So this might seem a little bit counterintuitive when you're thinking about green infrastructure. You often think about urban areas, but there's green infrastructure that needs to be put in agricultural settings as well. And even in urban areas, we do have urban agriculture is really on the rise in the United States, and it's becoming more popular. So there is going to be some opportunities for urban farmers and people who are farming on green roofs, as well as in more traditional agricultural areas. Now, before I move on to my more targeted project approach, I want to take a minute and pause for some questions. Please feel free to mention in the chat, or I don't know if there's a raise hand feature, but ask me live if you have any questions about this general green infrastructure stuff that we've been talking about.
So we don't have any specific questions yet, Juliana, but folks are really enjoying the job and career opportunity connection for sure. And Betsy was mentioning that you know, there are a few others that can maybe be in there too: landscape architecture, software design.
Yeah, those both absolutely.
So unless anybody comes up.
All right.
I think you're set to move on whenever. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, those are all really great comments in the chat, and I totally agree with them. So now that we have all talked about the basis, and it does sound like a lot of you all had some green infrastructure knowledge coming in, let's talk specifically about the project that I have been working on, targeted outreach for green infrastructure in vulnerable areas. So it's a bit of a mouthful of a project name, so I'm going to probably refer to it as TOGI for short. We just took the acronym for the first 5 words. So if you hear me saying TOGI, that's what I'm talking about, this project. So TOGI was funded by the EPA through the Chesapeake Bay Program. And the aim here is to develop a green infrastructure project design that is tailored to specific community needs. Through that, we are targeting 3 underserved communities in the watershed, 1 in Maryland, 1 in Pennsylvania, and 1 in Virginia. And we're going to work with them Specifically, these communities are also at high risk of climate change and have habitat of conservation or restoration value. We really want to make sure that our work is tailored to these communities' needs, which is what is really the most interesting, I think, about this project, is it's very important to us that we are going in from the ground up. So we're holding listening sessions to better understand what the community's needs are. We are going to them and asking them, what's the problem? And so from there, we're going to hold a secondary design workshop to come up with the green infrastructure project design after we've talked to them about what they need. But in order to do any of this, we had to figure out where to start, because the scope of our project extended throughout the entire watershed, essentially. So we developed a steering committee, and it was guided by a variety of experts. As we can see here on the slide, we've got climate experts, diversity and equity, habitat, GIS analysts, but most importantly, to some extent, it was people with direct connections to communities of interest. So overall, we used a pretty straightforward criteria-based decision-making approach, which I know previous MWEE webinars have talked a little bit more about. We knew we wanted to work in an area that was historically underserved by the environmental community. And so we focused in from that on communities that are largely communities of color and communities that have a high percentage of the population that is low income. We also knew we wanted that community to have valuable habitat in the surrounding area, something that we are working to protect or restore, and that they are facing significant climate risks. So once we knew we had those goals, we figured out how to measure them and created metrics that we could map to figure out which areas matched our criteria. All of the data that we used for this project, all of the metrics that we looked at are from open access sources. So that data was sourced largely from EPA's EJ Screen, EPA's Enviro Atlas, and Nature's Network and the Data Basin website, which are a product of the Conservation Biology Institute. And I think Elise and Krista said that they would make those links available in the chat either during this presentation or afterwards. And if not, I'm always happy to help you find them. We went through the steps here listed on the slide. So we started by deciding on the criteria of importance, visualizing the data one criteria at a time, and then at right, we can see one of our criteria that we've got visualized. This is our terrestrial habitat cores and connectors. Then we identified areas of overlap for that criteria. So we took a map for this and a map for the 5, 6 other metrics that we looked at and overlapped them and flipped between them to figure out which areas met multiple criteria. Then we narrowed down our areas of interest to just the communities that met most or all of our important criteria. And then from there, we selected one community to work with that we felt would be best suited for our project. One community in each state, to clarify. Again, it's one in Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. But the overarching goal of this project was not just to target a community and figure out which one would be meeting all of these criteria, but it was to actually engage them and design a project that was tailored to their needs. So our outreach strategy here was incredibly important. We wanted to make sure that this was, this partnership that we developed with each community was not transactional and that we worked to build a solid foundation of trust that could really last beyond the lifespan of our project. Our outreach can really be divided into 2 major categories as I've listed it. It's first, the more traditional outreach that you think of when you hear outreach, which would be the cold calling, the emailing. And then second, it was our listening sessions that I've mentioned before. Now that second aspect of our outreach is yet to happen. We are hoping to hold them in the spring and summer. We are a little bit delayed because of COVID, like I think everyone else is. And these sessions will likely be held virtually, almost certainly be held virtually at this point, but we are charging forward. And so these listening sessions are to help us figure out and better understand what each community specifically is struggling with. So if we look at what I've got listed here, I have on one side how we do our outreach. And so that started with analyzing our steering committee's network. So I mentioned my steering committee a couple of slides ago. And so that includes climate experts, diversity and equity experts, GIS analysts, habitat experts. And we really took a look at who we knew in each of these communities that we identified and figured out who we also did not know in these communities. And then through that gap analysis in our network, we are able to do some research to figure out how to fill in those gaps, and then ask those people who we reached out to also identify people in their network who they could reach out to, and really just build this very organic network. Then we are going to have our contractor conduct listening sessions to tailor the needs to the community. And then I mentioned some of this already, but why did we do our outreach this way? It's really that we want to put the community's needs forward at every stage, which I think so many projects try to do, but we really are trying to work from the ground up to make sure that we are building this solid foundation and leveraging existing connections to grow and build on our network. So now that you have an idea of what we're doing and why we're doing it, I want to go through an example of the maps that we used, because I want to show you really what it looks like when we were making our decisions. So these, I'm going to show you the maps that we made for our top 3 communities in Virginia. Now, we had at this point narrowed down the watershed to, or narrowed down the state of Virginia to just these 3 communities after looking across the whole state. And these are the exact maps that we use to make our final decision. So what we're going to do is I'm going to walk you through them, and then we're going to go on Menti, and I want you all to vote on which community you would have chosen after hearing all of this data and all the information that I'm going to walk you through. And then after that, we can kind of talk about why our decisions might be different. So let's take a look. All right, looks like it's, okay, there we go, perfect. So we're going to look at 3 different communities in Virginia: Montross, West Point, and Farnham. So let's start with Montross, Virginia. It is the county seat of Westmoreland County and has a population of just 384. The town itself is only 1 square mile, but we were planning to focus on the greater Montross area to expand to some of the neighboring census blocks, as well as that little downtown area that we see here. So the first criteria that we looked at was % of the population that was low income, because that was one of our diversity metrics that we were using. We can see here that there are 2 census blocks surrounding Montross that have pretty high percentile of low income residents. We've got 88th percentile and 42nd percentile here. And then we also looked at % of the population that belongs to a minority group. We can see that directly to the right of what we'd consider incorporated Montross, there is 73% of the population are members of a racial minority group. And then in the surrounding area, there's another one a little bit to the south where it is 80% of the population. It is worth noting that these are not the same areas as the low income residents that we looked at before. Next, we looked at the habitat value of the area. And this is the image that we saw on the previous slide that I was showing you. Is we can see these purple habitat cores connected by green habitat connectors. Now this is only terrestrial and wetland habitat. We can see that there's a ton of great habitat surrounding Montross in the just kind of forming a circle around the incorporated town area. And we wouldn't expect the actual downtown area to be super valuable habitat. So this is, we still think, really fantastic. This area is also high priority for black duck restoration, which is a priority of the Chesapeake Bay Program, but I did not show that data here. Now, if we look at the aquatic habitat cores and connectors, we see a similar story. There's a lot of really great aquatic habitat. So these obviously follow the streams and creeks and rivers of the area. And we can see that, I'll zoom in a little bit on Montross here, but we can see that it's really incredibly valuable habitat in this area as well, possibly even more close to the town and the community that we're looking at than that terrestrial habitat. Following up with that, we looked at the National Wetlands Inventory. We can see here, we've got a nice little key to the different kinds of wetlands, which I don't know if you all can read, so I will give you the highlights. We can see that a lot of the closest wetlands here are this dark green color along the river and around the town, which are freshwater and forested shrub wetlands. There's also a handful of estuarine and marine wetlands, which are a kind of teal. Next, we look at the National Flood Hazard Layer. The legend here, we can see that the river has a 1% annual chance of flood, but most of the community itself is not particularly high risk of flooding. Then we looked at sea level rise. This is, I believe, a predicted 3 feet of sea level rise. And we can see that even with 3 feet of sea level rise, Montross is not particularly at risk, which is great for that community. And our final metric that we looked at was marsh migration. And here again, we see that the community is not at particularly high risk of marsh migration. So I'm going to move on to our next community. I'm trying to give you really the higher level stuff, but I know that this is a ton of information to try and remember. So as I'm going through it, I'll try to kind of compare and contrast each community so that you can remember what we talked about. Next, we're going to look at West Point, which we can see. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's right here at the point of formation of the York River between the Mattapony and the Pamunkey Rivers. And that is on Virginia's Middle Peninsula, which we took into account the fact that West Point and the Middle Peninsula is being considered to become a NOAA habitat focus area. Now, this really does mean that NOAA's habitat work would be focused in this area, which could bring some really great resources to the community if we were to pursue working with them. So if we look at the percentage of the population that is low income, we can start off right here, south of West Point. We have a census block in the 92nd percentile, and that is nationwide for proportion of residents that are low income. But up here, we have a little bit less. Unlike Montrose, we do not have a significant portion of the population that belongs to a racial or ethnic minority compared to national standards. It's kind of all in that 15, it looks like here I have it as 15 to 20% in the West Point proper area. When we look at the terrestrial and wetland habitat cores and connectors, we can see that outside of West Point, especially along that left side where it says New Kent, I don't know if you can read that, we have a ton of valuable habitat. Again, this is a super habitat rich part of the country. And when we look at aquatic habitat cores and connectors, we see a similar story. Here, the Mattapony and Pamunkey Rivers, which are both just north of West Point, have a ton of valuable aquatic habitat coming out of them. It looks like the York does not have as much of the aquatic habitat, but there's always room for restoration, right? There's never tells all the story. Next, we have our National Wetlands Inventory, which again, we can see that along the Mattapony and Pamunkey Rivers, there are a ton of wetlands. Just the teal color, we have that is estuarine and marine wetlands. A little bit farther north, again, we get some freshwater emergent wetlands, as well as some freshwater forest and shrub wetlands. And then you see a smattering of these throughout the landscape. The national flood layer, we see that West Point is at a much higher risk of flooding than Montrose was. It has a 1% annual chance of flood hazard for much of the town, and a 0.2 annual chance of flood hazard for some other parts. When we look at sea level rise at a predicted 3-foot sea level rise level, we do see again that there is a pretty high confidence of predicted wetting inland from the sea level rise, especially along the two rivers again. And then marsh migration. Here, the key just tells us that the darker the red, the more likely that the marsh is to migrate. So we can see we have some very high likely marsh migration going on north of the city. So when we look at comparing Montrose to West Point, we see that Montrose hits some of our diversity and equity indicators more heavily. It has a lot of valuable habitat, probably more valuable habitat than West Point a little bit. But West Point has a lot more of the climate risks that we're talking about. It's going to be more affected by sea level rise, and it has a lot more wetlands, and it still has valuable habitat, and it still has a fair amount of the population that is low income, but maybe not as much as Montrose. So it really is balancing these types of metrics that we're looking at. Now, for our last town that I'm going to walk you through, we have Farnham, Virginia. Farnham is an unincorporated town in Virginia that has a population estimate of about 2,000 residents. So like I mentioned here, since it's unincorporated, it doesn't have a specific city. So when I talk about that, I'm just going to talk about the census block surrounding the word Farnham on the map that we're using to give us a sense of the general area that we're talking about. So when we look at the percentage of the population that is low income, we can see that this southern census block has a very significantly large percentage of residents who are low income. We have 71%, which is 97th percentile nationally. When we look at percentage of population belonging to a racial or ethnic minority group, we see that they are in a 77th percentile in one block and a 55th percentile in another. The terrestrial and wetland habitat cores and connectors, we see a lot more connectors here. That's that green area, but we also have a fair amount of habitat cores surrounding the town and in some of the nearby towns. Aquatic habitat cores and connectors. What's interesting here is we see that there's an aquatic habitat core going directly through what we are considering as the central Farnham area. So it could be really interesting to do some aquatic restoration work potentially in there. There's a lot of different things that we could do focusing on those aquatic habitat cores. When we look at the wetlands inventory here, we see that it is largely surrounded by freshwater and forested shrub wetlands, but it doesn't have quite so many wetlands as the other two communities do. Our national flood hazard layer, we can see, I think it still hasn't popped up, there we go. It is not at a very high risk of flooding, which is great. When we look at sea level rise, again, it's not looking like it is predicted to be significantly affected by sea level rise. And finally, we have our marsh migration zones. So when we're looking at Farnham, it's not looking like it's going to be significantly impacted by marsh migration. Now, I want you all to take a second and think about those three communities because we're done. That's all of the metrics we looked at. I know it was a ton of data to try and remember, but I want you all to do your best. I know you won't remember all of it, and I will point out that you guys are getting 10 minutes to look at this, and we spent actual weeks looking at the same data. So I do not expect you all to remember everything and come to that same conclusion. But now we're going to go to the Menti again. And let's see, there we go. I want you all to go back to menti.com and type in the code. Again, it's the same code as before. Which community would you choose? Looking at this data that we walked through, which community would you choose to develop a site-specific green infrastructure plan with? You're going to conduct the outreach. You're going to work with them to develop the plan. And remember, we are focusing on a ton of different metrics. So there really is no right or wrong answer. Just the fact that they got to this point means that they would all be worth pursuing. Great, it looks like we're already getting some answers coming in. Fantastic. I do like this diversity of answers. I'm glad that you all are seeing that there are benefits to working with all three of the communities. I'm just going to give it, this 14 is what we reached before. Oh, we're already at 15. I'll give it just a couple more seconds, and then I'm going to ask for a volunteer to give a quick reasoning why they chose, which community they chose. I know you all didn't expect to be called on today, but I promise I'm just looking for 30 seconds max, just what stood out to you about that community. Is there someone who voted to work with Montrose who would be willing to type in the chat or speak for why they would choose Montrose?
So no responses in the chat yet, Juliana, but what I love about this is, using data to make informed decisions and then being able to kind of back that up with our claims with some evidence. So this is really modeling a lot of the kind of MWEE approach that we do in the classroom. We'll give it another couple of seconds for people to chime in, but
I promise I won't make fun of you when I reveal which one we went with.
Okay, Bart says that he chose Montrose because it seemed more of a community that he could see working with.
Okay, great.
So I guess like the human dimension really stood out there.
Yeah, that's great. Is anyone willing to chime in about West Point, why they would choose West Point? Because that seems like it's our most popular option.
Hi there, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Cool, my name's Selena. I work at Aztec State Park, and I chose the West Point site because it seemed like it had more environmental impact from things like flooding and sea level rise.
Yeah, great. And I see in the chat, Lisa Bird had a similar answer. She's saying that mainly due to the abundance of wetlands and was concerned about the flood level threat. Really great. Is there anyone else who would like to make a point in favor of West Point? All right, well, I'm gonna ask for one of the two people who chose Farnham to give it a quick defense. What stood out to you? No one's willing to defend themselves? All right, that's fine. So I will reveal the big reveal that you've all been waiting for, that our project did decide to work with West Point. And it was for some of the reasons that you all spoke about. Is it really stood out when we were looking at habitat value and threat due to climate change with the marsh migration and the flooding. In addition to the fact that it was on NOAA's Middle Peninsula. And so it had a little bit of existing resources that could possibly be coming their way. And so we were really excited about the opportunities to leverage that funding and those resources that we could be given. West Point also does, north of the town, have two federally and state recognized Native American tribes that have reservations in the area. And we do have some existing relationships through the Bay Program with members of both of those tribes. And so we were excited about the opportunity to continue to work with them as well. So it did have a little bit of the human dimensions aspect, even though it may not have shown up on the map. I think it's worth pointing out that sometimes those intangible connections can also be a very worthwhile decision-making tool when you're trying to come up with your final decision. And now I will talk a little bit more about how this project could be useful to you all. I think that a similar project to this could really be very easily translated to a smaller scale. You do not need to use as much data as we are using. You can just pick one or two different criteria or metrics and have you and your students take a look at them to practice that criteria-based decision making. It's a great way to engage students with their communities if you wanted to have a project where they could design something for the school grounds or in a neighboring area, maybe a park. It doesn't even have to be a green infrastructure. It doesn't have to be a green infrastructure project. It could be really anything that would benefit the community. And it would really prompt those students to think critically about their community and those communities' needs. And what would not only be nice to have, but influential and impactful, and not just what they think people might want, is it would really put emphasis on reaching out to local groups and local community leaders and interviewing them about their needs to come up with these metrics that they're looking for. It could be a project they want to focus on, for instance, something that gives people new green space in the area. There might not be a lot of green space in like a downtown area, or it could be they want to build a something in a specific place, and they would interview the neighborhood to figure out what the people in that surrounding area would really want that place to be used for, and use the criteria-based decision making to narrow in on what the best option is. And with that, I would like to acknowledge everyone who has been a huge help on this project, and I would like to give special thanks to all of these people listed here. I'm not going to call them all out because it would take a long time, because there's a lot of people I have to thank, but I will specifically thank Elise and Krista for setting this all up and for helping me get ready to present to you all. And with that, I will be happy to take any questions. My email is right there again. If you know anyone who is working in West Point and would like to connect me with them, I would love to hear from you. If you would like to do something similar in your community, I would love to hear from you. Please do not hesitate to reach out.
Thank you so much, Juliana. Really inspiring, and so many connections to, I think, what a lot of us on the call today kind of do with students, and really try to emulate that in the classroom, those sorts of decision-making processes and using data to inform decision-making, and exploring and even maybe implementing green infrastructure as an action project within the context of a MWEE. So lots of exciting connections there. So I'd encourage and we don't have any questions in the chat right now, but I'd encourage anyone to come off mute if they'd like to ask questions to Juliana, because she's an expert in this space, and if this is something you could imagine kind of bringing into your programs, she would be the perfect person to ask about it. So we'll give a couple minutes.
Juliana, this is Bart, and I apologize
Hi.
if I'm echoey, but it sounds echoey. But so I wanted to ask if there are certain criteria that you think are really appropriate, like on a school community level or like a local park level, that one should look at if they're planning some sort of kind of green infrastructure project there.
Yeah, on a super local level like that, I think it will be really important to take into account something that we didn't really look at as much, but maybe like the topography of the area. I know that an issue that people frequently run into as they're designing green infrastructure projects is that, well, they need to, if they want to do a flood control project, they need to make sure they put it where it's flooding, for instance. And if they're trying to do a project that is not a flood control project, you don't want to put it where it's flooding. So things like that could be really important. I think also, if you're trying to look at like proximity to other people. So as much as we might think green infrastructure projects are beautiful, some people might not agree. And so making sure that you have a little bit of space between people and whatever you're trying to implement could also be really important. I think it comes down to being really site specific though. It depends on what you want to do and where you want to do it, what metrics you're going to need to use.
I have a question here. A couple are coming in now, actually. So oftentimes folks are working with like the facilities department on school grounds. And so what, students can obviously be actors in helping to like convince and make an argument for green infrastructure, but like, what are some of those arguments that you think are really helpful that might resonate most with like a facilities manager?
That's a really good question. I think that I have not had to work with a facilities manager before because I have not done this kind of work on school grounds. But what I would think could really resonate is that that kind of long-term cost saving is, because I know that a lot of times what people balk at is the upfront cost, especially when you're working on a school grounds, when you have a very limited budget, and I understand that. But the long-term benefits could be really helpful. Talking about the educational value is always helpful because it's a school. I know that there are some types of projects are more successful than others. So things like rain gardens, I've seen are more successful, or community gardens or pollinator gardens, that kind of thing, which can be maintained by students. Those are often more successfully implemented than things that will need to be maintained by the facilities management.
Yeah, that resonates with kind of what I was thinking too. Is there a good place to like that kind of cost benefit analysis of like gray versus green? Is there a place where you would recommend people kind of looking to be able to articulate that?
I am not sure off the top of my head, but I can send you a link later, at least.
Okay, awesome. And I can share that out with the group.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Lisa has a question. Did you develop a weighting system for the criteria? And which ones carried the most priority?
So our weighting system was very informal. I know that with a lot of criteria-based decision making, you do have a formal weighting system. It's like, this is 1 point, this is 2 points, or however you're going to do it. And there's a lot of websites that can help you with that to really set it up and make sure you can justify your choices that you make. But for this specific instance, we did not do that. It was really weighted by what the priorities of the Chesapeake Bay program were. And overall, what the Bay program's greatest priority was success for this project and really getting it implemented. And so we ended up putting a lot of weight on areas where we had some sort of existing connection because of how hard it is to go in with no connection to the community. And just kind of tell them that you're going to come and shake things up, because often people don't like to cooperate with that, completely understandably. So we weighted that very heavily, and we ended up weighting climate very heavily because we see how imperative it is to get moving on the climate front. But it really was an informal give and take kind of system.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Not seeing any more in the chat, so I'll just give another minute if anybody wants to unmute to ask their question. All right, well, I think we have all of our questions answered. Juliana's contact information is there on this last slide, so if you're interested in following up, is that okay with you?
Yes, please.
Awesome, thank you so much. And I think I have one more slide in this deck here before we jump off. So just a reminder that this is part of our monthly series, but this month we actually have two kind of webinars that I wanted to share. This one and then also another one that's actually going to be hosted through NOAA on the Community Engagement Guidelines for Excellence. And if you maybe noticed a trend, a lot of the webinars happening at the beginning of this year are specifically to support you in developing your BWET proposal, if that's something that you're thinking about this year, and that is open until March 1st. In February on the 10th, we have a webinar with the National Aquarium, Morgan State University, and Coppin State that's going to be talking about building authentic partnerships. So I think that will build really well off of the NAAE webinar. And then lastly, after BWET closes, but still incredibly relevant, Earth Force will be doing a webinar for us on planning and implementing civic action projects. So lots of fun stuff coming up, and we'll be releasing the next kind of series of 3 in a couple of weeks, but we hope that you'll join for those. And you probably get emails from me that say the links to all of those, but I will share that out after this as well. But with that, thank you so much, Juliana, for a fantastic webinar, and thanks everyone for joining us, and happy Inauguration Day, and we will be in touch with you all soon. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you all.